Manchester United, Roy Keane. If he wasn't playing in the team, we weren't as good as what we would be if he was in the team. There was so many fantastic players there, but he was our leader for me.
Teddy Sheringham never looked like a footballer. No pace, no flash, no sprint that made you catch your breath. He jogged where others flew and stood still where others pressed. 8 of the sharpest minds the game ever produced couldn't mark him, couldn't contain him, couldn't figure out what he was going to do next. So how does a man with none of the physical gifts football demands become the most intelligent player Sir Alex Ferguson ever managed? That's the question. And the answer changes everything you think you know about what it takes to be great. I am Oliver and this is Sport Icons. Ferguson didn't hand out compliments easily. 30-odd years at the top of English football, dozens of world-class players through his door, and when he was asked to name the most intelligent player he ever managed, he didn't hesitate. Teddy Sheringham. Not Cantona, not Scholes, not Keane. Sheringham. What makes that verdict hit so hard is the context Ferguson gave with it. He said Sheringham's lack of pace was simply irrelevant because his brain was always ahead of everyone else on the pitch. Think about what that means for a second. You're playing at the highest level against the fastest defenders in the world, and your manager's defense of you is that it doesn't matter, you can't outrun them. It doesn't matter because you never needed to. Old Trafford in the late 1990s was full of athletes built like machines. Cole, York, Giggs, Keane, these were players who could hurt you in a dozen different physical ways. Sheringham walked into that dressing room and stood apart from all of them, not because he was better on the ball, not because he worked harder, but because he processed the game at a speed nobody else could match. Ferguson had always wanted thinkers in his team, not just runners, but even by his own standards, Sheringham was rare. The night this became undeniable was the 26th of May, 1999, Camp Nou, Barcelona. United were losing to Bayern Munich in the Champions League final with seconds left. Ferguson sent Sheringham on as a substitute. Within a minute, he equalised. A few minutes later, with the game deep into injury time, he flicked the ball on and set up Ole Gunnar Solskjaer for the winner. United won the treble on the back of 2 moments from a man who had spent most of that night sat on the bench. That's not luck. Ferguson knew exactly what he was putting onto that pitch when Sheringham came on. He wasn't sending out a fast striker to chase a lost game, sending out a brain. A player who could read the chaos of those final minutes and find the one thread that pulled everything together. And Sheringham did it in 2 minutes when 90 hadn't produced it for anyone else. Ferguson's judgment that night was as sharp as anything he ever did tactically. He saw something in Sheringham that most of football had never fully credited, and he trusted it in the biggest moment possible. That trust was repaid in full. But here's the thing about intelligence in football. Ferguson could see it from the dugout. The players who had to live with it for 90 minutes had a completely different experience. For them, it wasn't admiration. It was something closer to helplessness. Tony Adams spent his career making strikers miserable. That was his job, and he was exceptional at it. 17 years at Arsenal, 4 league titles, 2 doubles, captain who commanded the backline with the kind of authority that made forwards think twice before they even touched the ball. Adams didn't just defend, he intimidated. He made the penalty box feel like his personal territory, and most strikers respected that and stayed out. Teddy Sheringham didn't care. Adams told The Guardian that Sheringham was a nightmare to face, and the specific reason he gave is worth sitting with. It wasn't that Sheringham was too fast or too strong. It was that he wouldn't stay in the box. He kept drifting, dropping deep, pulling into channels where a centre-back had no good option. Follow him, and you leave a gap behind you. Stay, and you give him the ball in space with time to think. Against most strikers, Adams could make that calculation and be right. Against Sheringham, there was no right answer. That's what made it psychological as much as physical. Adams was used to problems he could solve with positioning and aggression. Sheringham gave him problems that positioning made worse. And he wasn't suffering alone. Standing beside Adams for most of that era was Martin Keown, who built his entire career on being the hardest man in England to lose in a penalty area. Keown was methodical, obsessive about his positioning, had the kind of focus that meant attackers rarely ghosted him twice. He spoke to the Daily Mail about what it was like to face Sheringham, and he called it a psychological battle. What stuck with him was the subtlety of the movement. Sheringham didn't burst away from you or spin past you. He shifted, half a step here, a small angle there, nothing dramatic enough to trigger your instinct to follow. And then, before you'd consciously registered he'd moved at all, the ball was in the net. That's a specific kind of torture. You can't defend against something you can't see coming. Keown knew it was happening, could feel it happening, and still couldn't stop it. That's not a physical problem. That's a player who has thought 3 plays ahead of you before you finish the last one. The mechanics of it were deliberate. When Sheringham dropped into midfield, he pulled Adams or Keown with him, because leaving a striker that clever with time and space behind the defensive line is just not something you can do. The moment they stepped out to follow him, the gap opened. The runs from midfield had space. The ball came early, and the damage was done before the defender even got back into position. Two of the best centre-backs English football produced, playing together, communicating constantly, and Sheringham still found ways between them that neither could fully explain afterward. Adams admitted it. Keane admitted it. Both men had spent entire careers making strikers feel uncomfortable, and here was one who turned that dynamic completely around. He made them feel like they were the ones being played, and for 90 minutes, they were. If Tony Adams and Martin Keane were the hardest men in England to beat defensively, Keane was the hardest man in England to impress. He didn't deal in encouragement for its own sake. There were no pats on the back from Keane unless you genuinely earned one, and the United dressing room knew it. Players wanted his respect because it cost something to get it. Keane gave it to Sheringham freely. Speaking to The Independent, Keane singled out Sheringham's mental toughness as something that set him apart from almost everyone else he played with. Not his goals, not his link play, not his movement. His mental toughness, the ability to hold the ball under pressure, stay composed when defenders were pressing hard and the game was tight. The easier option was always to let it go early. Sheringham held it. He absorbed the pressure, kept his head, and made the decision that hurt the other team most. Keane said it gave his teammates total confidence because they knew exactly where to find him and they knew he wouldn't waste it. For the opposition, it was draining. You press, you commit, you put everything into winning that ball, and he just rides it, turns you, and plays someone else in. That kind of mental composure is rarer than pace. You can train pace to a degree. You can't train that. Keane's praise matters in a specific way here because of what it tells you about United's internal standards. This was a squad that had won the league multiple times, that expected to win every competition it entered. The bar for what counted as impressive inside that building was set higher than almost anywhere else in football. When the most demanding player in that environment singles you out as mentally tough, it means something concrete. It means you cleared a standard most people never get close to. Peter Schmeichel watched all of this from the other end of the pitch, and his angle on Sheringham was different again. From his goal, Schmeichel could see the whole game in front of him, the full shape of United's attack, the way the defensive lines moved, spaces that opened and closed with every pass. He told the Manchester Evening News that Sheringham's arrival changed United's tactical ceiling. Before Sheringham, there were moments in games where the connection between midfield and attack broke down, where the ball would go forward and there was nobody to receive it in the right position. Sheringham fixed that. Schmeichel called the link play world-class, and from where he was standing, he had the clearest possible view of how much damage it caused to opposition defensive structures. What Schmeichel could see, and what the full picture of 1,999 confirms, is that United's treble-winning team was the most complete side Ferguson ever built, and Sheringham was the piece that made the shape work. He spent most of that season coming off the bench, waiting, never visibly frustrated, always ready. Every time Ferguson called on him, he delivered. The Camp Nou finish is the one everyone remembers, but it wasn't a one-off. It was just the highest stakes version of something he did consistently all year. Keane respected it from beside him. Schmeichel understood it from 50 yards back. Jamie Carragher built his reputation on solving problems. That was what made him so good for so long at Liverpool, the ability to identify what a striker wanted, cut off the route to it, and force the situation onto his own terms. He studied attackers the way other people study film, breaking down their habits, their preferred foot, the runs they like to make. By the time a forward got the ball near him, Carragher usually already knew what was coming. With Sheringham, that preparation counted for very little. Carragher told Sky Sports that Sheringham simply didn't need to run. And when you stop and think about what that means in the context of the modern game, it's almost absurd. Football at the top level is built on movement, on pressing, on covering ground faster than the other team. Every defensive system in the world is designed with the assumption that forwards want to run in behind, want to exploit the space between the lines by accelerating into it. Sheringham stripped that assumption out completely. His one-touch passing was so precise and his spatial awareness so sharp that he could do damage standing still in places other strikers would need a full sprint to reach. Carragher said it made defenders feel completely powerless, and the word he chose matters. Not frustrated, not confused, powerless. Because there was nothing in the defensive playbook that applied to someone who operated the way Sheringham did. Gareth Southgate came at it from a slightly different angle. Southgate was never the most physically dominant centre-back in England, and he knew it, so he compensated by being one of the most technically prepared. He read the game carefully, tracked runners early, positioned himself to cut off passing lanes before they opened. Spoke to the FA about what it was like to face Sheringham, and the word he kept coming back to was awareness. Incredible awareness, he called it. The thing that made him impossible to mark wasn't speed or strength or any conventional threat. It was that Sheringham could see holes in the defensive shape that nobody else on the pitch had registered yet. Spaces that, where Southgate was standing, simply didn't exist, and then Sheringham would find them anyway. That's a different kind of problem from anything Adams or Keane described. They talked about where Sheringham moved. Southgate was talking about where he looked, what he saw before he moved. The action started earlier than anyone expected, in the reading phase, in the moment before the ball arrived. By the time Southgate reacted, the decision had already been made 3 seconds back. The two of them, Carragher and Southgate, represent a specific kind of testimony. Both spent their careers on the back foot against the best attackers in the world, and both came away from those careers with detailed, hard-won opinions about what made forwards difficult. When those two men point to the same player and describe the same fundamental problem, a striker who operated on a level of intelligence their defensive training simply hadn't prepared them for, lands differently than a single voice saying the same thing. And Sheringham was doing this late into his 30s, slower than he'd ever been, knees carrying the mileage of a 2-decade career, and still finding angles that men 15 years younger couldn't close. Most of the voices in this story come from England, defenders who faced Sheringham in the Premier League, teammates who played beside him at United, managers who had to work out how to use him. That context matters, but it also has limits. You might argue that Sheringham's game was built for English football specifically. His reading of space and his composure under pressure were products of a particular domestic culture. Then Gianfranco Zola opens his mouth, and that argument falls apart. Zola wasn't a defender trying to explain why he'd been embarrassed. He was one of the most gifted attacking players of his generation, a man who had played at the highest level in Italy and Spain before coming to England, who had been coached by some of the sharpest tactical minds in European football. When Zola talked about a player's quality, he was comparing them against a reference point most people in England never had access to. Told the BBC that Sheringham played the game like a chess master, always 3 moves ahead of the defenders trying to stop him. That framing is worth unpacking, because it's different from anything the defenders said. Adams talked about where Sheringham moved. Keane talked about the moment he'd lost him. Southgate talked about the holes he found. Zola wasn't talking about movement or positioning, he was talking about the thinking that happened before any of that. The planning. The way Sheringham read what was about to happen, decided what he'd do when it did, and was already in the right place before the situation had fully developed. He didn't react to the game. He predicted it. Chess players don't win by being faster than their opponent. They win by thinking further ahead. And Zola, who understood the geometry of attacking football better than almost anyone of his era, watched Sheringham and saw a man who had that same quality on a football pitch. Not physical superiority, cognitive superiority. That's a hard thing for football to reward. The game celebrates what you can see easily: pace, power, goals, dribbles. Intelligence shows up in the data only if you know what you're looking for, and for most of Sheringham's career, the wider audience wasn't looking. He was left out of England squads he deserved to be in. He spent seasons coming off benches he shouldn't have been sitting on. He won the biggest honours the game offers and still finished his career without the kind of universal recognition that players with half his football brain routinely collected. Zola saw it. Ferguson saw it. 8 of the most respected people in the game saw it clearly, from different angles, in different languages, in different roles. Still, somehow, Sheringham spent decades being undervalued by the very sport he understood better than almost everyone playing it. No pace, no physical presence, no highlight reel moments that looked impressive on first viewing, and yet 8 of the sharpest minds football has ever produced couldn't find an answer to him. Sheringham didn't run the game. He thought it, and by the time defenders caught up with where he'd been, he was already somewhere else entirely. Subscribe for more stories like this, and drop a comment below. Was Teddy Sheringham the most underrated footballer England ever produced?